Well, hello, welcome back everyone. 2 years ago on November 18th, 2022, Metroid Prime celebrated its 20th anniversary. To celebrate this incredible milestone, I released a video adapted from one of my early college research papers dissecting the game's unique soundtrack through the lens of diegesis. I definitely recommend watching this first, if this is your first time engaging with these videos, but all of that, as I mentioned, was nearly 2 years ago. Time sure has a nasty habit of flying off, doesn't it? While nowadays, the thought of a game sequel releasing merely 2 years later is absurd, 2 decades ago it was practically the norm. And naturally, when you release a title as critically acclaimed as the first Metroid Prime game, a sequel is inevitable. Thus, here we are in the blink of an eye arriving at the 20th anniversary of Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. This video is going to be a bit different from Prime 1's musical retrospective. For Prime 1, we analyzed that game's score in the context of the previous Metroid titles and the philosophies of their composers to see where it stayed faithful versus where it went in new directions. Metroid Prime 2 Echoes was solely composed by Kenji Yamamoto, who was largely responsible for the music in Prime 1 and was one of 2 composers who worked on Super Metroid. Echoes, being a direct sequel, unlike Yamamoto's other Metroid titles, largely occupies the same soundscape as the first game, reusing several of the same sample libraries, synth patches, and pads, so there aren't a lot of radically new ideas to talk about, at least on the surface. What's more, is unlike other Metroid titles he's been involved with, Yamamoto never gave any interviews or insight regarding his work on Metroid Prime 2, not that I could find at least. With the Prime 1 retrospective, I was able to back up a lot of my personal interpretations with the written ideas of the composers, whereas here, that's just not possible. Outside of raw music theory and a couple of interviews with some other staff working on the game, everything here is my own personal interpretation or assumption. Echoes is held in very high regard in the Metroid community, and it's far from uncommon to see people proclaiming it as their personal favorite. Outside of the community, however, while it's still generally looked at positively, it doesn't quite seem to hold nearly the same admiration as its prior entry. The same can be said about its music, which outside of the community doesn't seem to be talked about as much. My hope is that this video can nurture some discussion on the matter, whether it's on the underrated aspects of the score, or why it doesn't resonate for as many people in the same way the first game did. So how do you follow up on such a critically acclaimed score? Which aspects do you keep that are essential to the winning formula? What risks do you take to differentiate it from what came before? How do you perfect something that's already been deemed perfect? Let's jump in. Much like Prime 1, Echoes makes its first move to the player in its title sequence. The Echoes title theme is an interesting piece of music, especially when contrasted with Prime 1's title, as they're both attempting to do very different things. As we discussed last time, Prime 1's title theme immediately sets the framework for music as a storytelling device by using instruments that sound as if they could be completely diegetic in the game world, despite very clearly being non-diegetic in practice. Spoilers for later, we'll definitely continue to see that philosophy employed all over the Echoes soundtrack. However, this title theme's goal is seemingly not being used as a device to set that up like in the first game. There's some shared patches as mentioned earlier, like Pass Mine from the Korg MS-2000, which is used to play the motif originating in Prime 1's title, or the Church Choir from the Roland SC-88 Pro module, iconically used throughout the Metroid Prime trilogy, as well as a bit in Metroid Zero Mission. Quick aside, a huge thanks to Cinemax for discovering and archiving all of the material referenced today. Go check out his channel to see the full list of instruments as well as a slew of original music too. Now, back to the video. This new title theme is not trying to occupy the diegetic gray area like Prime 1. It is very clearly trying to be an enjoyable piece of non-diegetic music that still feels at home in the Metroid universe. We even have the addition of electric guitars featured prominently at the front of the mix, a first for the series. According to former Retro Studios sound designer Clark Wen, Yamamoto had initially pitched a space rock inspired track after he was brought on to compose Prime 1.
Kenji Yamamoto came on board and we were all excited about that, and he actually gave us a very early prototype track he did that was meant for the title screen, and it's never been released as far as I know. But it was very different than what we ended up with the final Prime soundtrack. It was very guitar heavy, like a space rock kind of thing.
Perhaps the Echoes theme carried over some of those ideas from that initial pitch. Why the change in direction so early on though, especially if the rest of the game still adheres to that original philosophy? I have a couple of hypotheses on that. Metroid Prime introduced a lot of new players to the series, so perhaps the audio team felt it necessary to use a piece of music that would subtly cue the player in and entice them with the surrounding mystery. Meanwhile, Echoes would be assumed to have many returning players, making that need to ease in less of a priority. Echoes also marks the first time a second original Metroid title appeared on the same console. Most Nintendo series only received one mainline entry, so having a more celebratory theme to welcome back fans of the first game might have felt like the more appropriate direction to go in. Purely speculative on my part though. This track is heavily built off of the Chozo Ruins theme from Metroid Prime, to the point where I'd almost call it a cover if not for the new melodies being highlighted. We went over the Chozo Ruins last time, and much of that analysis carries over here as well, particularly those subtle animalistic call signs, droning breaths, and the scurrying of insects. There's a bass drum present here as well, made to sound like a heartbeat, something not present in the Chozo Ruins. This is the Alien Steps preset, and it comes from the Emu Orbit 3. Is this Samus's own heartbeat, or the hint towards others further into the area? This heartbeat also matches the pattern at the intro of the Echoes title. Maybe there were subtle hints in that music after all. The first melody we hear in the landing site immediately points at a foreboding sense of mystery, perhaps in relation to the mysterious storm that took out Samus's gunship. It's hard to hear amongst all the other instruments, but there's a breathing sample layered underneath the melody whenever it comes up. This piece continues into the Splinter Hive Samus drops down into. Once Samus enters the Hive Tunnel, she's greeted with the first visual of deceased Federation Marines in the game as we transition to a new variation of the theme. The heartbeat is gone within the first measure and doesn't come back, further driving home that none of the Marines stationed here made it out. It's a grim sight, though the new melody introduced doesn't indicate hostile to us. Despite the littering of Splinter corpses leading up to this moment, the worker Splinters here have no interest in us and are simply feeding on deceased organic matter. Scanning them reveals that, in fact, unlike standard Splinters, they are non-combative. There's a third variation of this theme, but before we get to it, something major happens that we need to talk about, which gives a lot of context to some of the more subtle changes in the music. Deeper into the Hive, Samus activates a bomb slot to restore power to one of the gates blocking the path forward. But on her way back to the terminal, this happens. Out of nowhere, a dark alien substance materializes out of thin air and reanimates the deceased Federation corpses. These zombified Marines immediately begin attacking us, and we have no choice but to fight back. Everything about this track is completely erratic as a result of the rapid-fire 16th notes being barraged from the leading instruments. The bass placed at the front is Analogatry from the Emu Orbit 3. We'll learn later in our adventure that the alien substance is actually a species from an alternate dimension called the Ing, and this synth patch is present in their main battle theme too, essentially making it their calling card. What's more is the filter phase from the Echoes title is back accompanying the bass here. Between the heartbeats of the landing site and now this, was the title theme hiding references to the opening segment of the game this whole time? Or is it all just a coincidence? I'd like to believe the former, but we'll never know for sure. Side note, but did you know that there are actually two versions of this piece? The original, being played now, appears in the North American and European releases of Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. However, the Japanese version includes a different mix of the Analogatry patch, which was later included in all regions of the Metroid Prime Trilogy Wii release. final variation of the Splinter Hive theme plays once the Dark Troopers are all defeated. Much of the animal call signs are gone, highlighting the bassy hums normally kept deep in the mix. The first melody from the landing site returns, now with the underscore breaths much easier to hear as a result of the more minimalistic instrument selection. The light chimes from the second melody can also be heard layered on top. The biggest storytelling device, though, can be heard in the return of the heartbeats, slightly muffled now as if the music is trying to mimic the zombified heartbeats of the Marines. Metroid Prime 2's central conflict revolves around the Luminoth versus the Ing, Ether versus Dark Ether. This is reflected in the music as well, and it's now becoming more apparent as the introduction nears its end. Upon stepping into the Great Temple, the gigantic structure that teases us after entering the temple grounds, we're greeted with a peaceful ambiance that indicates a safe haven. The drones in the back are shared with the elevator room, so the transition to this new piece of music feels seamless. What's new though amongst the drones is a melody played in a higher register than anything we've heard yet, a stark contrast to the low bassy end warbles and percussion we've become accustomed to in our fights. This section is played using the BG Singers patch from the EMU Orbit 3. This progression is played in C major as C7, B6, A6, G6, F6, E flat 6, F6, and G6. I've indicated here where a half step occurs with one parenthesis and a whole step with two parentheses for any viewers who might be unfamiliar with reading music. Now what's interesting about C major is that it has no sharps or flats, yet as you can see, there's a chromatic alteration made to E6, lowering it to E flat 6. If we played a C major scale diatonically, or without any adjustments, it would be a half step. However, instead, it's a whole step here. While the theme is still warm and positive, this minor adjustment throws some very subtle imbalance into the piece, indicating that maybe this place isn't quite as bright as we're led to believe. This is what the melody would sound like diatonically without any chromatics. Pay attention to this. This is important. This will come up again later as this melody is going to become a recurring motif throughout the game. After defeating the Alpha Splinter, Samus makes her way to the top of the temple where she meets U-Mos, the last sentinel of the Luminoth. Here U-Mos explains to Samus and the player their plight, their war with the Ing and how close they are to the brink of defeat. Here we see the melody from the Great Temple reprised and built upon into a full theme. The instruments effortlessly blend into the harmonious hum of the light energy controller that takes up the center of the room, as if the device itself is making a final, desperate plea. I've weirdly never talked in depth about the choirs in any of these analyses before, despite them being a Yamamoto signature. I think this piece is the perfect time to talk about what makes a Metroid choir so unique, given their building prominence throughout the piece. All of the choirs used by Yamamoto throughout the Metroid series are entirely electronic. An electronic choir has the potential to sound cheap or fake if not utilized in the mix right. But these electronic choirs are always flanked by other digitized instruments and samples that occupy a similar space on the audio spectrum so that it blends into the soundscape more easily. As a result, these electronic choirs still give off a sense of organic structure that instead of sounding human in nature, sound alien and otherworldly. The second half of the piece escalates by adding some traditional instruments like harps and snare drums before climaxing with the full choir at the front of the mix. It goes from a piece celebrating the last bastion of light on Ether to a commanding military march of a leader prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice in the face of certain annihilation. Have you ever stood in a forest while it's pouring rain? One thing you'll notice is the heavy pattering of rain will sound amplified due to the reverberation as it bounces off of the surrounding trees. Wood is used for acoustic amplification in several auditory applications, such as speaker housings, studios, and auditoriums. This is relevant because we find ourselves now in the Torvus Bog, a flooded Luminoth outpost built into the forests of Ether. Every single instrument has some pretty noticeable wet reverb applied to varying degrees of intensity. Paired with the long drones, it's as if the music itself is falling from the clouds above. Even the snare drums have this light pittery-pattery mix to them, like they form the puddles of the piece while the hi-hats represent the rainfall itself. The main melodies of the piece are played with the turn wheel patch from the Korg MS-2000. It's also used for the double time progression introduced at the beginning of the piece that almost sounds like a theremin. We've talked about the Ing, but we haven't really discussed Dark Ether yet, and how that affects the music of Metroid Prime 2. Dark Ether, as introduced much earlier on in the game, is a twisted alternate reality of the Luminoth homeworld. The colors have these deep, saturated purples, reds, and blacks. All of the wildlife is menacingly hostile, and most importantly of all, the very air itself is corrosive to inhabitants born outside of the Dark Realm. It is the very definition of unwelcoming. The music is also reflective of this inverse in a few ways. Themes associated with the Ing and Dark Ether use much lower registers than those associated with the Light World and Luminoth. Each of the Dark Ether area themes occupies some of the lowest registers in the entire score, using almost exclusively bass tones. While each area has hints of the melodies that occupy their Light Ether counterparts, they're quite distorted and not at the front of the mix, which still prioritizes atonality. It reminds me a lot of Metroid 2's area themes, which rarely feature any melodies and don't emphasize meter. It's focused solely on being an extension of the environment and not as a listenable piece of music on its own. Here with Dark Torvus Bog, for example, you can still hear a few slowed down notes from the main melody, as well as the introductory progression, but they're fleeting. They also aren't lined up with the single bass drum playing a repeated whole note, which adds to everything feeling disjointed. I believe these Dark Ether themes are a large part of why a lot of people don't resonate with the Echo score as much as the first game. There aren't that many on paper, but you spend a lot of the game visiting the Dark World. These areas aren't meant to be places the player looks forward to going to, and the music very much plays into that. If you enjoy the tension and sense of dread that Dark Ether brings, then there's a pretty good chance that these more experimental pieces accompanying these sections resonated with you. However, if you're someone that loathes going to Dark Ether because of its more oppressive atmosphere or its subdued art direction, the music is almost certainly not helping you out. I personally love the dichotomy between Light and Dark Ether, and I find the musical relationship between the two incredibly fascinating. But I also understand why it might not be everyone's cup of tea. Everything has led to this. With an intro like that, you know we've reached the final boss. Every inch of planetary energy has been returned to Ether, except for one final cluster guarded by the Emperor Ing themselves. All of the music we've talked about so far has been in a 4/4 time signature, or 4 quarter notes for every measure. However, the first phase of Emperor Ing marks the first piece in the entire series we're covering, which is something completely different. This piece is played in 6/4 and if that beat feels familiar, it's the same time signature as the Torvus fight from Metroid Prime 1 as well. Like I talked about during the Dark Troopers chapter, Analoga Tree from the Emu Orbit 3 is used for rapid 16th notes on ing-adjacent battle themes, and it's immediately put to use here, providing bass for the main melody, kicking off the piece with a burst of energy. Alongside are some high-pitched, piercing synthesizers that sound eerily similar to the Ing's battle cries, as if the music itself is making a final stand. During the B section of the piece, though, something quite interesting happens. A new melody is introduced, and after 3 measures, we hear something familiar. It's the same melody we discussed earlier during the Great Temple. Up until now, aside from the Dark Energy controllers, we've only heard this motif pop up in Light Ether and Luminoth adjacent themes. This is the first time we're seeing it in the complete opposite context. And there's a few important changes to take note of that allows this motif to flourish in this new example. First off, because this piece is in 6/4 instead of 4/4, the exact number of notes in each melody aren't identical. More importantly though is a key change to A minor, and this time without any chromatic alterations, meaning the melody is played diatonically. This is where it gets really crazy though. Our new key is in A minor, but do you remember what our original key was in? That's right, C major, the relative major to A minor. For my non-music theory viewers, every major key has a relative minor key and vice versa. A relative key is determined by the number of sharps or flats present. The adjacent key that has the same number of sharps or flats is that key's relative. This is because the notes are completely identical but start at different positions on the staff. In the case of C major and A minor, both keys contain 0 diatonic sharps or flats, and the only difference between these is that C major starts on C and A minor starts on A. That's it! This is also why it's important to make a distinction between diatonic and chromatic harmony, as a single chromatic alteration on its own doesn't necessarily change the key signature. This discovery kinda blew me away when I first noticed it. Kenji Yamamoto hit a theme right in front of me in a piece of music I had been listening to for nearly 2 decades, and I was none the wiser until fairly recently. Oh, but if you thought this rabbit hole was over, you're dead wrong. There's one more interesting thing about this piece. 6/4 is not a common time signature used in the Metroid series, but as mentioned before, it has appeared in other pieces like Torvus. If we change the key signature from A minor to E minor, that changes our diatonic F notes to F sharps. Now we just need to make a slight adjustment to the note progression, this time working our way back and resolving on the median, the 3rd scale degree, instead of ending on the dominant, the 5th scale degree. Okay, we're all set? Sweet. Now watch this. Okay, not gonna lie, this one is probably just a coincidence, but man is it cool. Hey, speaking of references to Metroid 1, Metroid Prime 2's finale is just kinda perfect, isn't it? Escaping Dark Ether to one of, if not the best versions of Metroid's iconic escape themes, all leading to an epic showdown against Dark Samus, now more powerful than ever. This section is gonna be short, I don't have a lot to say, but one quick thing I did want to point out because it's, and I quote, literally the coolest shit ever, is how an actual self-destruct alarm is playing triplets throughout the piece, resolving every 2 measures. Again, this is what I love so much about Kenji Yamamoto's work in the Metroid series, how he so cleverly finds ways to weave aspects of the environment into the very foundations of the music itself. I also got to give a W to the choirs coming in for the melody reprisal on the repeat. Such an awesome addition. And there it is. Just like that, we've reached the end of this retrospective analysis. Another anniversary has come and gone. I never initially planned on doing a sequel to the first Metroid Prime analysis. That video was adapted from an early college research paper I had done, whereas this was completely built from scratch. After how well the first one was received though, I kinda felt an obligation to make this one a reality. I guess I have no choice but to finish the trilogy with Prime 3 eventually, but at least I have 3 years to prepare for that one. Metroid Prime 2 Echoes is without question my favorite soundtrack in the Metroid series, and one of my all-time favorites in general, frankly. While the first game is more revolutionary in its approach to the score, Echoes is such a meaty refinement that still has its own unique flavor without undermining what the first game brought to the table. If you're like me and also love this criminally underrated soundtrack, I hope I did it justice. If not, I hope maybe I could help you see it in a new light, even if it still ultimately doesn't work for you. And if you haven't played Echoes at all, well, hopefully we get Metroid Prime 2 on the Switch in just a few months, just like Metroid Prime Remastered dropped 3 months after the last video. Not only was getting that remaster in and of itself such a treat, but it came with re-encoded 48 kHz high-definition audio. If we could at least get that for the rest of the trilogy, man. In the meantime though, we finally have our first look at Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, and I'm eagerly anticipating to see where Metroid's music goes next. Maybe that will get its own analysis too someday. Take care everyone. I'll see you all next mission.